Okay, the next thing that we want to talk about are the various toolbars that are available. Notice that whenever we're working within a web application, we get a special toolbar that allows us to modify and format the visual aspects of our web page that we're currently working on. This is called the formatting toolbar. Notice that I got to this list of toolbars by right-clicking in the toolbar area, anywhere in the toolbar area, and selecting or checking a toolbar that's available. So, for example, I might want to use the layout toolbar, which I'll demonstrate its use in just a few moments here. Notice when I do that the toolbar extends off to the right-hand side. It starts here with these little buttons that are arranged vertically, and this is a handle for that toolbar. So I'm going to place my mouse cursor over it. Notice that it turns into a cross, and I'm going to hold my left mouse button down and drag down, and notice that it created a new line for this toolbar, and I can position it in place. I can rotate it to the right or to the left. I'm going to position it over here, and this will come in handy in just a few moments, but that's how we add and remove tools or toolbars from our toolbar area, by either checking or unchecking the various items, the various toolbars that are available. Okay, so for now that's probably enough of a discussion of the various windows and toolbars and how to manipulate them within the Visual Studio environment. Let's now talk about how to position the actual controls that we drag and drop from our toolbox onto the designer surface. And one of the first things that you'll notice is whenever we start to drag and drop items onto our designer, like for example I've dragged a label and I'm going to try and place it over here in the lower right hand corner, that it automatically pops open to sit right next to the button control. Now if I try this again with a text box, it still goes right next to the label. So how can we get some more flexibility with the layout of the text and the controls that we add to our web pages? Let's take a look at the source view of this web page to get a clue of what we need to do. As you can see, we have our controls, the button, the label, and the text box controls, but there's no paragraph tag or no break tag in between these controls. So that's why they line up automatically next to each other. So in order to change their position, I would have to use a number of spaces with using the keyboard, which is not a very effective way to go about it. And to change their vertical positioning, I may have to use the Enter key on the keyboard a number of times in order to introduce some break tags or paragraph tags onto my web pages. But again, that's not the perfect solution. Now what many of us have done in the past is to insert tables and use them in order to lay out our web pages. So I'm going to go to Layout, Insert Table from the menu, and then this allows me to select the number of rows and columns that I want to include within a new table that I'm going to introduce to my web page. I can also set things like the alignment, the border, cell padding, and cell spacing from here as well. I can even adjust individual cell properties if I wish to at this time, or I can select them individually and set them in the Properties window. I'm just going to click the OK button for now, and notice that it produces for me a 3x3 table into my web page. So I can drag and drop. For example, I'll put my text box there, I'll put my label in this cell, and then I'll take my OK button and I'll drag and drop it down to this cell. And then I'm going to run my application to see that I've got some more advanced layout control over my web page than I had previously. And this is certainly one option, and an option that most people take whenever they're designing their web pages, to use tables in order to do that. But there's also another option. Let me delete everything from here by just selecting it with my mouse cursor, then hitting the delete key on my keyboard, getting all the way up to the top. And I'm going to go to the Layout menu again. I'm going to go down to Position, and then go all the way down to the Auto Position options. I'm going to select this Change Positioning to the following for controls added when using the toolbox, paste, or drag and drop. And so at this point, I'm going to have absolutely positioned controls whenever I drag and drop them from the toolbox. I'm going to click the OK button now. So let's go ahead and try this again. I'm going to drag and drop the the button from the toolbox, And now notice that I can position it anywhere on the web page. Now how is this accomplished? Let's take a look at the source view and notice that a style tag is now inserted into the definition for my button control, which gives me a z-index, which means, how are the controls overlapping, the left position, and, the top position here kind of extends onto 2 lines, and that is positioned absolutely. Let's go back to our design view. And we can position a label as well. Now when we drop it, it might place it over in the left-hand side, but we can drag it around and move it to its position. Let's go ahead and delete these 2 controls off and play around with our options just a little bit more. I'm going to switch back. Layout, position, auto position options. I'm going to remove the checkbox from here and click OK, which puts us back into a relative position. We also have the option to insert what are called layers, and layers are absolutely positioned areas that we can introduce into a relatively positioned web page. So notice that I have relative position here, and I have absolutely positioned areas here, and within these areas I can drag and drop controls. So this is kind of an in-between solution where I can now reposition groups of relatively positioned controls within a relatively positioned web page. And yet there are still other options as well. I can, I believe, set each individual control and change it to be absolutely positioned. By actually selecting it and then going to the layout menu one more time, going down to the position submenu and then selecting absolute for this single control. So there are my options for moving things around. Everything else is currently relatively positioned. This one control now has been changed to be absolutely positioned. So while the emphasis between relative and absolute positioning, because I find this to be one thing that confuses developers when they think they're wanting to work with an absolutely positioned environment but only getting relatively positioned results. So hopefully this will answer one of the big question marks in your mind. And it really comes down to the source code that's added to each of the controls. When we relatively position that last button, as you see here is selected at the bottom, all it did was just add the style property and set some of its subproperties. The left, the position equals absolute, and top equals 113 pixels, and so on. The other 2 controls, the button and the text box, don't have those properties set. Okay, so enough about that. Let's go ahead and delete all these controls off, and let's move on from here. Okay, one more feature I wanted to show you before we move on is let's insert a table. We'll just set our 3x3 table. Okay, now say that I want to select a given cell in order to modify the features of that cell. What I can do is also use these little selection areas down at the bottom to select an individual cell or to select the content of the cell. Okay, so this gives me the ability to select an entire row at a time, the entire table, an individual cell, or just the content that's inside of a cell in order to modify its properties. Okay, so let's go ahead and delete this as well. Just want to make you aware of that navigational ability that you have through this tag selector here at the bottom. Okay, now on to the fun stuff. I promised you that we were going to take a tour of some of the controls that are in the toolbox, so let's do that right now. First of all, for this example, what I want to do is go to the Layout menu one more time, go to Position, go to Auto Position Options, and then change the auto position to absolutely positioned, and click OK. So now everything we add to our form will be absolutely positioned. Okay, so for this example, what I want to do is just create a really simple little data entry interface that we might use on like our company's intranet, for example, where we allow a project manager to take a look at the various sub-projects that are going on and what the status of those projects are and what department that they're billable to and so forth, and allow our staff to enter their current statuses for various projects. Now we're going to make this very simple, so we won't make it too complicated. It'll give us a springboard in order to demonstrate some of the various controls that we'll come in contact with virtually every day while using Visual Web Developer 2005 Express Edition. So one of the first controls that we were able to use in our previous lesson were the label controls, and these are simply just textual labels with a programmatic interface like we used in the previous video. You'll recall to change the content of that label by setting its property equal to hello world or whatever the case might be. So in this case,